this conversation, this webinar is called Preaching About Racism, a Guide for Faith Leaders. And this webinar is based on my book that's coming out next month. Technically, December 5th is the launch date, but if you pre-order the book through chalicepress.com, it should be getting to your address in November. The basic reason for writing this book began over a decade ago when I was serving in admissions at Princeton Seminary. I was Associate Director of Admissions. And at that point, I had been in ministry for several years. I had worked on the US-Mexico border as a chaplain. I had been an associate pastor at a church in San Antonio. And I had been to seminary where I had, for the first time in my life, really learned more about racism as an ongoing problem, not as something that was in the past, but something that still occurs today. Now, as a white person, talking about racism made me feel very uncomfortable, very anxious, and hence the name of my first book, Anxious to Talk About It. I think sometimes our anxiety around this conversation of not knowing what to say, of not knowing if we know the right words to use, of being afraid we'll be called a racist, all of those kinds of fears can often get in the way of us having these kinds of conversations. So in my beginning research, when I was working in administration, I started thinking, how can we have these conversations in a way that doesn't lead us into this shame spiral or feeling like, oh, I'm just a bad person, I don't know what to do, so I can't talk about this anymore. And I came across the work of Beverly Daniel Tatum and her work on racial identity development theory. She'd published an article in the Harvard Educational Review in which she talked about bringing up this particular theory in a classroom in which she was talking about racism. Now, the theory goes like this: just like there are developmental stages among children, welcome. Just as there are developmental stages among children, there are developmental stages for persons who grow up in this racialized society in terms of coming to understand what it means to be racialized in a particular way and how we feel about that racialization. So for instance, for people of color who have grown up in a society that has given them a lot of negative messages about who they are, about standards of beauty being primarily judged against white standards, it's really important in racial identity development for persons to reclaim a sense, hello, welcome, to reclaim a sense of self-care, of love, of being able to recognize their own struggle against the injustices that they experience. But that's not the only side of racial identity development. Beverly Daniel Tatum was talking about how for her white students in this course on the psychology of racism, the white students needed to see that there was a stage of progression for them too. So the feelings that they would experience of shame, of feeling like, oh, I don't know what to do, or a desire to withdraw from the conversation, that all of these kinds of reactions were a normal part of the process, but weren't the final goal. That wasn't the end result that was hoped for at the end of developmental stages, but rather for white people to see that they can follow in the footsteps of other white people who have spoken out against racism in their history, in their time, in their place, and letting white people know that they also can make a difference. So I drew together some of the elements of racial identity development theory as I was working on my PhD after I left Princeton Seminary to pursue full-time PhD studies at Emory University, getting to work with Tom Long and Teresa Fry Brown, some amazing preachers and homileticians. And again, trying to draw from a lot of different sources, how can I best support white preachers in talking about race with their predominantly white congregations? Because that was the context that I had grown out of. and was the context that I assumed I would be returning to as a white preacher, wanting to make a difference, wanting to try to speak out against racism that was ongoing. So I was able to take courses across the university in theology, in political theory, in linguistics, and all of these courses together helped me kind of bring together kind of a strategy or a goal, a plan for how I can help people talk about racism. And some of that comes out in Anxious to Talk About It, the book published by Chalice Press in this past February of 2018. But that book is written for a broader audience, for persons in your congregation, for small groups. It has a lot of stories because I believe that narrative is an important way for us to enter into these conversations. But I also wanted to give additional tools to preachers. And so this second book, Preaching About Racism, a guide for faith leaders, is meant to add additional resources for those of you that are getting up in the pulpit week after week, trying to figure out how do we talk about racism in today's context. Several of the problems or challenges that I found in talking about race and racism is that, one, there's not a common sense understanding or definition of what race and racism means that everyone agrees with. If you grew up in certain parts of the country or certain neighborhoods, racism looks one way to you. If you grew up in another neighborhood, it looks a different way. So helping people know, first of all, that it's very challenging to communicate about this, primarily because we're not speaking the same language. Now, if you go to an anti-racist training or a diversity training, there are a lot of great educators who will kind of walk through a definition of racism to help everyone be speaking the same language early on in that event. But what I've found in communicating in congregations is that you can't count on everyone having gone through an anti-racist training session, and you are always getting new people coming in and out, so you can't assume that everyone is using the same definition or the same working knowledge of what you even mean by the word racism. So one of the chapters in the book Preaching About Racism kind of unpacks some of the ways that maybe we've been taught to think about racism, or some of the ways that we may inadvertently still communicate about racism that aren't exactly helpful. So for instance, I was talking with a group of middle school parents this morning in Austin, and one of the parents was saying, you know, if we can just help our kids see that racism is stupid, you know, like, I think we can help them see, like, yeah, why would you believe in these false stereotypes about people? Because that's just dumb. Maybe if we get our kids to think that way, then it will mean that they're less likely to be racist. One of the problems with assuming that racism is a problem of ignorance or stupidity is that it kind of misses out on the long history of intentional segregation that has financially benefited some groups and disadvantaged other groups. So for instance, after World War II, when veterans are coming back from the war, the GI Bill that was given out to many of our veterans was given out at a local level. So the benefits of getting a low interest mortgage, those were given through local banks, and it was up to the bank whether or not to give that mortgage to a person of color, even if they were a returning veteran. So you see a huge, a really great disparity in terms of the number of white veterans who were able to get the GI Bill versus those who were people of color coming back from the war. So you get a mortgage, and as a white person, your mortgage, you have a good interest rate, you're able to pay it off, and you see that property value over time appreciate, and you're able to pass on that wealth to future generations. You're able to live in a neighborhood that you want to live in, that have great schools. Then you have this simultaneous story of people of color who are returning from the war. And in our the national guidelines for the Federal Housing Authority, the underwriting rules that dictated how to give out mortgages, which investments were less risky than others. This is where you have the beginning of red lines, literally lining out the neighborhoods that were the riskiest investment, people of color primarily, but also immigrants from Eastern Europe. A lot of places where there was a high density of poverty. So say you're a person of color, say you're an African-American vet who comes back from the war, and you're given this GI Bill, and you say, great, okay, let's get a house. And you go to Levittown, and they say, you know, sorry, this is a new home, you know, neighborhood that we are building for our returning vets, but you know, we can't let you in here. This isn't, you know, all the homes are sold now, even though we might let, you know, someone who comes behind you who's white have one of these houses. So you have someone like that turned away, and then that same person turns and goes to a neighborhood that might have more people of color in it, but because the underwriting deems it as a riskier investment, he may still get denied that mortgage because it's a riskier investment, and the underwriting redlining may say, we're not going to write a mortgage for that. So he goes into that inner city area and he has to rent. And by renting a year after year after year, he's not building up equity, he's not able to put down roots, and he's not able to pass on wealth to his children. So if you are living in a neighborhood where, for instance, you know, people who are living in predominantly white neighborhoods, there are different housing values, and over time we have had laws that have prohibited housing discrimination, but still today, as neighborhoods change demographics racially, the housing prices are affected. And so when the GIs were coming back after World War II, for instance, realtors would come in and prey on white homeowners and say, look, this neighborhood's going to be turning bad. You need to, you know, sell your house and get out now while you can. So we have this white flight where white people are selling their homes, and then the real estate agent turns and sells it at a great profit to a black family coming in who sees their home value start to go down because the neighborhood values overall are going down. So in terms of economics, as you think about racism as a larger kind of system historically, it makes sense. It's rationally in the interests of those who have the power and the wealth to want to hold on to that wealth and to keep it for themselves. And so it was very intentional the way people chose where to live and chose the neighborhoods. And they can be making these decisions without any clear racist intention, not clearly wanting to be harmful to other people, but you see how economically over you know, generations and over across cities and across our country, it does make a big difference, and it keeps some people in chronically disadvantaged positions compared to their white counterparts. So I say all that as a way of saying, if we just dismiss racism as a matter of stupidity or a matter of ignorance, we lose sight of the way that racism can be deeply entangled with people's rational self-interest, rational pursuit of profit, trying to do good business in their mind. And so it's really important that we say, okay, it's not just about stupidity, it's not just about ignorance. There have been people who have been intentional about trying to get profits in ways that have been unduly harmful to some groups. I see it in Austin here. In 1928, when the city devised a new city plan, African Americans who had been living adjacent to white families in the heart of Austin were told they were not going to get city utilities until they moved to the east side of what is now I-35. And so there was this mass exodus of African Americans in Austin having to live on the east side. Fast forward to the last 2 decades, you've seen huge growth in Austin, a lot of skyscrapers going up like every other week. And so property values are going higher and higher. And people who are living in East Austin no longer can afford to live in East Austin because corporate developers come in and say, we'll give you, this huge amount of money if you move out. And so you have poorer families who can't afford the increase in property taxes and can't afford to say no to these corporate investors moving even further out. So we have a city that is actually decreasing in its population of African Americans, unlike most metropolitan areas. So all that to say, when we talk about race and racism, we're talking about something very big. We're talking about something that has to do with history, that has to do with our financial system, that has to do with our politics. And so because you have all of these really kind of deep entanglements when we're talking about race and racism, it's not something you can cover in one sermon. So for those of you that were hoping to get ideas for that one sermon, hate to disappoint you, but this is something that people have been working on a long time and that we'll need to continue to work on for a very long time. So how do you begin to do that? How do you begin to communicate about what racism is in your preaching? One of the things to do is to help expand a person's understanding of what racism looks like today and what it means, using stories, using statistics, using individuals, and helping people hear through those stories kind of a bigger picture of what racism means. But the second thing that I found to be a deep challenge of talking about racism or preaching about racism is the fact that when we're talking about race and racism, we're talking about identities. We're talking about something very personal to each and every one of us. As a white person, I've been socialized to think of myself as an individual, to not think of myself in terms of the white community or the white world. I've always just been myself. If you had asked me, to name my identity, I might say Texan because I grew up in San Antonio. So that connection with racial identity and being white, for me growing up, wasn't there. Now, if you grew up in a different era, that might be very different for you. Identifying as white can feel very, very wrong, since in earlier eras, people would clearly differentiate between white and people of color, and only white people could sit in certain places at a church or at a movie theater or use that bathroom or that water fountain. And so to many people, not naming that identifier feels like that's an improvement. To go without labels is something that was necessary, to say everybody can use any bathroom, any water fountain, any seat in the house. But at the same time, it's important that we reclaim the significance of those identities because of their ongoing impact in the world. There's a lot of literature out there that talks about white privilege and naming the different things that white people are able to do without worrying about them compared to persons of color. And I think it's helpful for us to use some of those examples to name some of those differences. But at the same time, because talking about race and racism is so personal, it deals with your own identity, I think it's also crucial that we integrate our understanding of the emotions and psychology behind the persons that are listening to you talk and preach about racism. So I mentioned Beverly Daniel Tatum's work earlier. In Preaching About Racism, I have a whole chapter that talks about racial identity development for the congregation, for understanding how these different emotional responses and psychological responses may play out in our congregations. And the reason why that is important is because it allows us to be compassionate for ourselves as well as for others. So if I'm feeling a resistance to wanting to talk about this because it's stressful, I know there's going to be people who are uncomfortable. If I'm at least aware of those feelings, I'm able to sit with them. I'm able to be okay with those feelings and to move through them. But if we don't attend to those feelings, often they can become another obstacle, another excuse for why we just can't do this, or why this is not appropriate for us to talk about now. So helping our congregants, our listeners, also understand that they're going to be feeling some pretty strong feelings, and it's not just white people. There are plenty of people of color who are really wary of having these conversations with other white people because they've done it before, and some of those experiences have been good and others not so good. And so there's reason for people to have some anxiety. There's reason for people to have some hesitancy about having these conversations. So what connects to the a third reason for this challenge. The first challenge was understanding what racism means. The second challenge was the kind of identity piece and what that makes us feel as individuals in terms of identifying ourselves racially. But this third challenge is recognizing a response. So once we've kind of learned more about racism, we've tried to grapple with what it means to be persons of color or white people living in this society. Then what's the next step? What do we do now? And something I name in Anxious to Talk About It is this distinction between the word responsibility and responsibility. And I make that distinction not because there's a lot of difference there, because responsibility can still be a helpful and important word. But I have found a lot of people feel, along with the word responsibility, a sense of shame, a sense of guilt, a sense of duty, which may or may not be a helpful way of rooting your own action. Whereas responsibility, focusing on our ability to respond, allows for a more open-hearted approach to say, okay, I might not be being asked to do anything right now, but just to listen. I can listen to these stories, to these experiences, and think about how I can respond in solidarity, in compassion, having that openness to move from an initial reaction of defensiveness, I'm being asked to be responsible, instead to kind of an open posture of responsibility, thinking about our ability to respond with love and open arms and building that connection. And one of the ways that we do that is through this concept of gratitude. As Christian preachers, we base our preaching on gratitude, not shame or guilt. We don't try to live differently because we feel bad about who we are, but rather because of the deep gratitude we feel for God's grace, for what God has already done in us and through us and for us in Christ. And because of that gratitude, that inspires us to live in new ways. Similarly, when we're talking about something as painful as racism, I think when you're talking with predominantly white groups, it's important to talk about gratitude as a motivation, as a way of a practice of expectation. So rather than coming to these conversations with tension, with anxiety, with dread, how can we have this practice of expectation that I'm going to be grateful for something that happens in this exchange? I'm not sure what it is. It may be a hard story that I get to hear, but I'm going to feel grateful for something that happens. And having that expectation, again, puts you in a posture to receive the people that are there in that room, that are there to share their stories, and enables you to show up and be present with the gifts that you yourself have to share. So those are kind of some three big overarching principles as I think about preaching about racism, is helping our congregants grapple with what racism means, helping our congregants grapple with their own racial identity, and help them move towards a healthier space. And then third, helping congregants understand and deepen their capacity to respond through gratitude. So when I'm planning sermons, often those three moves are part of this hermeneutic that I bring to the scripture. I take those three parts and think about how can a sermon that I'm preaching, drawing from this particular text, incorporate these elements? Is there a story I can share that relates to this scripture text that helps open our eyes to the reality of racism? Is there a part in this text that I can connect ourselves to, helping our listeners and myself feel like I am part of this story, I'm implicated in it, and yet I'm given an option to respond? Is there a way that we can help our listeners feel part of this story? And then third, this movement towards gratitude. Where can I find good news, something to be grateful for in this text as we're talking about racism? What is the good news that I can find here that I can be grateful for and that I can encourage my congregation with? And letting that gratitude, again, be what sends us out to do good work. Now, preaching, again, it's not just one sermon that we can do to address all the problems of racism. Obviously, there would have been plenty of great preachers who would have accomplished that long ago, but it is a long-term effort. It's a regular engagement. And so in the book, Preaching About Racism, I have a chapter on preaching and beyond. So what are some other ways that congregations can get involved? I have some suggestions there too. Well, let me just close with this. I really do want to empower everyone to be able to have these kinds of conversations and to be specific. This morning when I was talking with these parents, someone said, well, can you change your words a little bit to majority and minority? I mean, because that kind of covers a little bit more. And I said, that might be helpful in some contexts. But when we're talking about race and racism, it really is important that we be specific because this harm has been so specific and continues to be experienced in specific ways that it's important that we name it. And it makes us uncomfortable to name, but that discomfort shouldn't prevent us from naming it. And I encourage those of you who are preachers, who are preaching regularly, to again see yourself as going through a process as not having arrived at being woke and now you're ready to tell everybody how racist they are, but rather a sense of, again, as Albert mentioned, a sense of humility to know that we're going to still mess up. People might assume that we're racist and we might say things that hurt others, but as we grow in relationship with one another, as we let down our defenses and trust that we have those gifts to offer, that those relationships will be avenues for learning. We'll learn how to get it right. We'll learn how to do better. So as preachers, having that attitude that I'm growing, I'm learning, and yet this is a gift of learning that I want to share with my congregation. I'm not standing above them, judging them, but I am trying to be prophetic in a society that still experiences deep harm. And how can we together as a church stand up and speak out against this, encouraging our congregants to recognize the gifts that they have to offer. In every group that I've been part of, at some point when we have the questions, I've been amazed by the people that are there and the kinds of contributions they can make. Last Sunday, there was a person, a white woman who, shared that she has a brother-in-law who's in law enforcement, and she was really worried about the kinds of stories that he shared at the dinner table and would laugh about. And she herself is lesbian, married, and she has felt some discrimination against herself from this brother-in-law. So she didn't really feel comfortable talking about how he has talked about his work with him. In just, few seconds later, this newcomer to the group, an African-American woman, and I say, well, she's been in this same kind of law enforcement. Why don't we ask her what she would recommend that you do? And sure enough, she said, yeah, you can go to this website and contact this ombudsman, and this is what you do, and this is what they will do in response. And it was just this beautiful connecting of resources. Like, yes, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are a lot of people that already have resources out there to help us make a difference. And this morning, when I was speaking with these middle school moms, one mom who was white and has my same name, Carolyn, she comes from South Africa, and we're sharing, just with tears about the shame that she bears having grown up in South Africa during apartheid, and how being now kind of a foreigner in some ways, she notices that she's treated differently because of her accent. Her kids don't want her anywhere near their schools. But she notices in doing a Be the Bridge group. There's an organization here in Austin called Be the Bridge, Bridge Builders. You create this group where she's been able to talk with women of color, African-American moms. And when they get together and are having these conversations, her eyes are opened, and she sees that even though she, they joke together that they're African-American and she's an American African, that she is still accepted in some circles more than these other women are. So even though she feels like an outsider in some cases, she still often sees that she is still accepted in ways that these Black women aren't. And so she's like, what can we do? Can we do like a bridge builders here? And, again, it's that gift, like, oh, here's a mom who might be willing to lead a group of, interracial conversations at this middle school. Awesome. So again, it's an openness to the gifts that are already there in your congregation, and letting the people who have a passion, who have a sense of calling, to be able to take leadership and to not be afraid of making a mistake, but to know that we all need our gifts working together to be able to address a wrong this hard and this deep. So I want to thank all of you for joining the conversation with us today. This has been recorded, and it'll be uploaded later so that you can rewatch parts of it. I talk fast, you can slow it down. But again, thank you for the gifts that you bring to this conversation and for the work that you all are doing in your own ministry settings. Blessings. Goodbye.